Hello, everybody, and welcome to this episode of Let's Talk About. And we're continuing on the theme of talking about suicide. And I'm delighted to have Aldo Kane here today. For those of you that don't know Aldo, I'm going to get him to introduce himself and his background and some of the amazing things that he's done, including Channel 4 documentary that's on recently. And you've got a challenge coming up as well, Aldo, haven't you, to raise money around awareness for the subject that we're talking about. So welcome. I'm going to hand over to you to say hello to people and let them know what you do and why this is important to you.
Hiya, thanks for having me on, Nicky. Yeah, my name is Aldo Kane, and I've spent the last 30 odd years now, 32 years working in extreme remote hostile locations around the world. I joined the Royal Marines at the age of 16. I spent 10 years as a sniper there, and then traveled around the world, basically providing safety, inverted commas, safety for high risk, high consequence filming, so television and film. So that would look like getting crews inside of active volcanoes, looking after film crews that are, working in narco-held jungles, looking after people on expeditions. So really that high risk, high consequence arena, and it would be my job to look after those people. So I've spent, like I say, the last 30 odd years working in that sort of high risk sort of environment, and probably have quite a few insights into how I manage my mental health, but also having seen and operated in an organization that is only male, and I believe the subject that you want to talk about is, I believe from the statistics, is 3 out of every 4 suicides are male, and it's the biggest cause of death under 50. So for me, there's lots of reasons to be interested in this. One, I've been touched by suicide by 4 or 5 good friends, all military, and I've got 2 young boys. They're male by default, which means at some point they could be part of the statistics, as could I. I'm 48 years old now. I'd like to think I manage everything well enough not to end up going down that road. But having said that, you don't know what's around the corner, and all of these things have led me basically into a position where I like to raise awareness of it. I'm not trained or qualified in any of this, but I raise awareness and money for the Royal Marines charity, which has actually had a really bad year. The Royal Marines have had a really bad year this year for suicide, which obviously means that old way of doing things isn't working, or the pressures of modern life aren't working, for us. I say us generally as blokes, but I mean it's women and men, obviously. So that's kind of my background and why it's of interest to me.
Yeah, thank you, Aldo. I really appreciate your openness and honesty around that. And that statistic 3 out of 4 is that hasn't changed. That is the what I think the worst it's been, but it's always been historically more men look at taking their own life. And I'm really wondering why that is. What is it about how we treat men that's different around how women are able to communicate? Now, I know we haven't got time to go right into that because that's a whole other conversation. But I know that men communicate in a different way, and I'm not a man, so I can't say what's right and what's wrong. But from speaking to some of my male friends, there is definitely a difference in how women communicate with women and have that safe offload space than there is with men and men.
I
What's
can
your
tell you, having spent a huge chunk of my life working in A-type environments, with men, and that is, and I'm talking about men, and because I am a man, so
yeah,
but this is across the board. I can tell you that there are unwritten sort of expectations, I think, of what a man is and what a man should do and how a man should cope. Now, where these come from,
Mm.
Who knows? Maybe they were adaptive 100 years ago or 1,000 years ago, but wherever that sort of story is, that ethos is, is not working. And the proof is in the eating of the pudding. Men are killing themselves rapidly. And so, I think there's a lot of external pressures of how we should be able to provide for people. And that, I would say, over the years has been a physical thing. As a man, you could be physical and do a job and be, recompensed for that with cash, with money. So we could be physical, we could get paid, and we'd have a value in the working marketplace. And I think over the last, with automation, computers, internet, like that the death of the industrial era, those jobs are few and far between, and they're not well paid. And this is just my viewpoint,
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
and as a bloke, I'm not well suited to sitting down at a desk, typing away, getting softer fingers, and moving spreadsheets around. Like me personally, need to be out and about and moving my body. And so I know for good mental health and a good foundation of mental health, I need to have some very basic stuff covered in my life. And that for me would be exercise and movement. That's out the window if we're not lifting and shifting and moving and doing stuff. I'd need to be getting my sleep sorted. And if I'm doing the lower paid jobs that are still manual, it's likely that's going to be shift work and my sleep's going to be interrupted. Um, and then that social connection piece is probably the biggest one. I feel like over the years, the stuff that I've done could have led to, potentially traumatic incidents that could have led to me having a different outcome to where I am now. War fighting, Ebola, seeing thousands of people dying on the streets firsthand in Sierra Leone, West Africa, um, and various other different things being, and so I've gone through the ringer with a lot of these things. And I think one of the biggest things that, getting back to, that I think makes a difference, and to get back to your original point about communication, is that we as blokes don't necessarily have that social network that women do, and therefore we don't have that off gassing or that pressure cooker sort of, when we can talk about stuff and talk about stuff in a psychologically safe environment, which is the other weird sort of juxtaposition, in that people on the outside would look at the job that I do, and it's very masculine. It's very, I say inverted commas masculine. It's it's very action filled. It's all of these things that you would expect of an adventurer guy, right? And people would expect you to be this like solid wall of, that you can just roll over anything and you're indestructible and you're resilient. But the way that I am like that is because I have psychological safety in my elite performing teams, that I can put my hand up at any time and say, I'm not comfortable, I'm scared, I'm worried. And without worrying about someone stabbing me in the back because I've said I'm scared or I can't do the thing or this is too much or I'm stressed. So I often think that's part of it. So getting to your point, I think we potentially feel like we have to take on all of this stress without opening up to other people, and I'm guilty of it myself.
Mm.
Um, and then the social ecosystem is such a huge part of, and this is anecdotally from me, that social ecosystem is such a huge part of managing stress, either in the moment or down the line. And I would say it's very predictive of a resilient outcome.
Mm. Yeah.
Sorry, I talk
No, no,
around.
that's great. I
Go
really
down.
appreciate that
Well,
because you've highlighted four really important things, I think there. One is resilience, and you've talked a little bit about how you manage your own resilience.
yeah.
I'd like my question around that is, how did you learn to do that? The other one is value. Having feeling valued, feeling validated, feeling like you belong somewhere, um, having that value in life. So research shows that for us to feel valued, we have to do something that we believe is valuable, but we have to also feel valued whilst doing that thing. And that's how
Yeah.
we get the whole picture. And then identity, which of course is such an important thing. I don't know if you've ever experienced this when you've left the military and then moved into your other role, and then maybe as you've got older, things have changed. But certainly when I left policing after 31 years, I was like, well, who on earth am I? I felt my identity had been completely ripped from me.
Yeah.
And with that came a whole load of emotions and grief and loss and processing all of that as well. So, and then the fourth one that you mentioned was asking for help. So if we start with resilience, and you talked about being outside and moving, that works for you. And again, a lot of research shows that this really does help us with our mental health. But how did you actually learn that, Aldo? What was the
Yeah.
point where you went, okay, I can connect resilience to this?
So if someone was to say to me, am I a resilient person? I could give you a handful of scenarios that have happened in my life and say, I have bounced back stronger from this and it could have taken me down. So I'd say, yes, I am at that point. I was resilient. And I would say a lot of that probably comes from that confidence in coping and sort of conviction and I suppose like optimism for the future comes from doing a very hard thing at a very young age. So I did the longest, hardest infantry training in the world at the age of 16. So by the age of 17, I was a Royal Marines commando. So I had this huge well of, now it's physical, right? It comes from the physical in the first place, which I find so interesting. I had this huge well of knowing that I could go through this thing and almost everything that could get thrown at me was probably not as bad as that. So I think that resilience piece, all a lot of it boils down to mindset and your ability to, I suppose, deal with situations in the moment and then down the line. So I'll be honest, have just ground through 40. I'm 48 now. I ground through, the first 45, 6 years of my life being very resilient in lots of different areas and not really knowing too much about it. And then about 2 years ago, I met Professor Andy McCann, and this is his work is human performance in high risk, high consequence areas. And we've sat down over many a time and talked about all of this stuff, and he's helped me write um, and ultimately what he's done is kind of validated scientifically all of the things that I have been doing, which have meant by luck that I'm able to manage my resilience. But it's not complicated. And I'm talking like I have never, as far as I'm aware, suffered with a mental health illness. I've certainly had periods of my life due to what I've been doing that's made me feel sad or blue, but I've never been diagnosed with it, so I can't say how effective this is. But it seems like the science is pointing to get the basics right, and it's a very good point to then I suppose move on from there. So I'll give you an example. I was locked inside a nuclear bunker for 10 days on my own in the dark with nothing. I had a bed and I had food for 10 days. That was it. And I came out of there utterly depleted mentally, physically, and emotionally. And it's what I took away from that is my sleep was interrupted. It was a circadian rhythm experiment for the BBC. They were interrupting my sleep every night. So my sleep was interrupted. I had no social ecosystem. I didn't see daylight to reset my body, and I wasn't exercising. So it was those like four things. And so that sort of hammered home to me. And Andy then sort of corroborated with it is that if you don't get the basics right, then you're undermining your own resilience on a daily basis. And we do this all the time. Through fear, fatigue, lack of focus, rumination, undermines our ability to be resilient. So that's the first point. Get the basics right: sleep, exercise, nutrition. Second thing, I think, where was I going with that? So I think the second thing would be to having a purpose, like you talked about there. But if you have a purpose and you're aligned with it, then it's quite easy to have that inner strength to get through hard times. And then another point would be that to realize that you're not a resilient person. I'm not a resilient person. And that changes during the day. It changes during the weeks and the periods of your life. At 48, I'm more resilient than I was mentally at 22, for example. 3 deaths in a year of my close family when I was 21, 22 could have had quite a profound effect on my life. At 48, I can be much more pragmatic about it and deal with it, if that makes sense. So you're at different parts of your life, you're more resilient. You might be less resilient. And at different sections of your life, you can be more or less resilient. I'm for years was very resilient physically and mentally, but was pretty fragile in, say, relationships, or fragile in, I don't mean like uh, loving relationships, but then relationships with friends. Or so I guess it's that understanding that it's like any other part of your body. To be physically fit, I must train my body almost every day of the week. And to be mentally robust slash resilient, I need to also train that part of my system, and it's a daily thing. I do hard things fairly regularly. I'll do one or two big hard things physically a year, and that kind of recalibrates me into like not getting soft.
Mm. I love the way you just say I do one or two hard things, like this casual, like a hard thing for me might be to do a triathlon, but when you talk about hard things, so I would use the word extreme when I think
Yeah,
of you, but
I guess
that's
it's
obviously
like
from my perspective, but yeah.
yeah, I guess it's like contextually, something hard for someone might be three mates to go out and climb Snowdon on a spring weekend.
Mm.
It's hard for them, but what you learn from doing those things, science shows that overflows into the next week of your ability to cope, your capacity to cope, your mental and physical and emotional well of strength. So I know the value of that, and that's why I do it. And there's loads of people are going to argue and say, well, I'm not physically XYZ, but the science says the physicality, the physical part of this, of being outside in nature, doing hard stuff, directly correlates to your ability to deal with a potentially stressful time in your life. It's
Mm.
directly correlated to how well and predictive of how well you will, and your physical fitness, how well you will deal with that stressor.
Yeah. Yeah, and for those that are listening, and you might be thinking, well, hang on a second, Aldo, I've seen you on Channel 4 and you do extreme things. Actually starting, so just going for that first walk, getting out the door, getting started on doing something, making it a routine, making it consistent, committing to something we know is
Having
incredibly
yeah,
powerful. Yeah,
having that bias to action
yeah.
in whatever the thing is gives you that semblance of control.
Yeah. And then the achievement as well at the end, around for your own mental health, that feeling of self-worth, of creating that discipline. I mean, there's so much research on this now around consistency and commitment, and as you say, what you do physically then shows up in the rest of your life because you're able to manage things in a very different way. Lovely. Thank you for that resilience. Let's talk about value. Let's talk about, because you talked about the male role and bringing value and what that looks like. Um, and for me, I've seen, so I have spoken to a lot of people in crisis who have been suicidal, and often one of the things that I find that they come back to is, where is my place in the world? I don't feel that I have any value right here, right now, which has brought me to this place of, well, the pain is so great, I don't know whether I want to live or die anymore. What's your experience around that yourself, having changed, doing something quite, I'm going to use the word extreme again. So at the age of 16, 17, where you became commando in the Marines, which is an incredibly because we know that the human brain doesn't fully develop until our late 20s. The male brain around risk is further behind anyway. So I'm just wondering if you could just run us through your early years and those value points, and if there was a point in your life where you felt a little bit lost and confused and that you weren't of value.
I think, you hit the nail on the head there. By the time I had left the Marines after 10 years service at 26, the part of my brain that makes me a reasonable human being had only just finally developed, your prefrontal cortex. So, so in a way, the values that were driven into me from the Royal Marines about, are really about discipline. And because they know they have a lot of young men who don't yet have a value system. I certainly didn't. I would, at the age of 16, you literally been a schoolboy and that's it. And you don't have really any self-awareness. You're invincible. You're, indestructible. So the Royal Marines gave me a framework, and a set of core values. And they actually have the commando spirit is a 4-point sort of like structure for the Royal Marines. They don't ever teach it. You don't get a lesson on it. But by osmosis and default of going through that training and becoming a commando, you understand what these are. So the commando spirit is, and like I say, this was lost on me even through all of my time in the Marines until recently that I've started reflecting on it. But that framework of values would be courage, determination, unselfishness, and cheerfulness in the face of adversity. So, and it's not what you would look at on the face of it. Courage, were they going to run out in front of a load of bullets and rescue a mate? It's much more about the other courage, moral courage, about doing the right thing when it's the hardest thing to do. So when you're stressed, when you're pressured, you're all that part of your brain shuts down. So it's even harder to do the right thing. And then especially when no one's watching. So like moral courage. And that's been a fundamental part of my life, is like, don't be a dick, do the right thing, even if it's hard. That conversation, that thing that you need to do, like do the right thing. Determination and drive, really, that's about teaching you about motivation and discipline and understanding that intrinsic motivation, being motivated by yourself for yourself, is much more powerful when things are harder than extrinsic. But we live in an age now where we've got young boys, men, girls that have been brought up on external validation on social media, likes, follows, like all of this stuff directly undermines your ability to do hard things, because you're constantly looking for recognition. So that motivation, understanding where that's coming from, and then understanding that it's fallible, and at the end of every day you lose motivation, every week, and every month, and at the end of the year you're much less motivated. So motivation has its part, but then discipline is the thing that actually is what looks like motivation on the outside. So courage, determination is the motivation piece. Unselfishness, it's such a big part of the Royal Marines ethos. They never teach you to be unselfish. They don't give you a lesson on unselfishness. But if I was to see someone like Foxy, if I was to see that he had dropped something and he didn't notice, and I didn't pick it up, or I didn't look out for him, that's much worse. And if I get spotted doing that, that's much worse, much worse, because it's an integrity call, really. And actually, when you look into the science of unselfishness, you want to feel good about yourself. Go and do a good deed for someone, and don't tell them, and don't let them know it's you, and just see what that makes you feel like. I definitely think there should be a move of people doing like these good deeds. It does make you feel good. But that unselfishness is about looking out for other people, and in a way it's sort of like enlightened self-interest, because those people then are looking out for you. And then the final one, I'm waffling on here, but the final one is cheerfulness in the face of adversity. So these are all things that underpin values, I think, they're solid values there, cheerfulness in the face of adversity. We can't change lots of things and we don't have control over lots of things, but we can definitely be in control how we respond to those situations. You can do it with a smile on your face. So it helps. But those values, because I didn't have a value structure of my own,
Mm,
they were instilled into me, and they now form the core solid part of my being, which means that when I'm feeling low, and when, if that ever happens post expedition, it's well documented. You come back from a big trip, you spent a year planning it, you do it, you're successful, you climb Everest, you go to the bottom of the seabed, you do these things, and then you come back home, you go and fight a war, and then you come back home,
mm,
and you've got to do the big shop. And the kids are kicking off. They don't listen to you. You're an expedition leader that everyone listens to because you've got authority, and you come home and the kids don't care who you are. Your dad, so you've got these periods of adjustment. But I think that value system that the core instilled in me means that when I feel that way, I use my discipline. I go out and I do the run because I know that's going to make me feel better. Or I go, right, what is the situation here? What's my options? How am I going to fix this? And I'm not saying that I've got it right by any chance, but what I do think is having some sort of set of values does help in bolstering your resilience, your mental health.
mm.
And I think it's well documented that a misalignment of values is one of the biggest causes of burnout and overwhelm in the workplace. We're seeing huge numbers of burnout, with the workloads increasing, with AI, with robotics, with all this stuff that's coming in, and no psychological safety in the groups, that we see people's values that are not in line with the organization they're working with, then burn out much quicker.
Yeah. Yeah. And you get that. I have worked in a role where my values didn't fit with it. And I just felt like a round peg in a square hole. And it became challenging. And I've spoken to other people, and it becomes a place you don't want to go to work. You don't give fully. You kind of lose your sense of purpose. You think, well, what am I doing? Why am I here? And all of those things start to build up, and it does bring you there, it does bring you down. So yeah, working in line with your values is such an important thing, and living to your values is such an important thing, because we know when we're not living into our values, that's where we feel really uncomfortable, and it causes that misalignment. Thank you. And that leads beautifully into identity, and you talked about it. You talked about being the expedition leader, planning, doing all those things, then coming home and having to do the big shop. And I should imagine, actually, that certainly I can talk about it from a organizational policing perspective. You do all these incredible things within policing. As a hostage and crisis negotiator, I saw a different world that I would never have seen if I hadn't have done that job. And then you come out, and I remember I live in a little village in North Bedfordshire, and I'd walk down the village and people would say hello to me, and I'd be like, why are you saying hello to me? What do you want? What's going on? What's happening here? And there was nothing happening, but I was just
No.
seeing the world through a totally different lens. So let's talk about a little bit about identity, and how you can manage that, and how you can come home and do the big shop and talk to the kids who you are literally, don't care if you've been done this, done that, won awards, whoever you are, your dad, and I need you to do this for me right here, right now. Let's talk a
Yeah.
little bit about that.
Um, I suppose the first thing for me to realize, or to, I suppose, vocalize, is that I had a huge identity crisis at the age of 26 because I had got into, arguably one of the hardest fighting forces on the planet, and spent 10 years there doing an incredibly interesting job. Sniper, reconnaissance, lots of that sort of stuff. And I only did it for 10 years, but I mean, it's quite a long time, as it's most of the formative parts of my, I suppose, young adulthood and sort of latter childhood, was formed by the core. And then I left on my own volition. The thing that quest for adventure that drove me into the Marines and allowed me to do that hard thing also then drove me out, and I didn't quite know why.
Mm.
At the time, I was sort of fighting myself. I had this internal fight going on. I was now doing the job that I had wanted to do my entire life since the age of 12, and something, my gut was telling me it was time to get out and do something else. Uh, I'm glad I trusted it because it got me to where I am now. Um, but I had this internal fight. I then left, and I then had, I'd say probably a year of miserable jobs. I'm talking like bottom of the rung, selling gas and electricity, working in bars, door work, and just being like, who am I? Like, I used to be this guy. I could have stayed in for another 20, 30 years, and when you're in the Marines, when I was in the Marines, I felt like, I could walk out on my own into a pub, into a situation, and I was like, I am a Royal Marine Commando. Like, you've got 5,000 blokes behind you in your head. It was identity. It wasn't just a job. It was this like way of life. And then when that's gone, especially when it's gone through your own doing, it's quite a tricky. I found it quite a tricky transition, but I think I relied heavily on almost all those attributes, those core values, and that bias to action that had been drilled into me, this discipline thing, to not be the one sitting, doing nothing or feeling sorry for myself. And also I mentioned earlier the Royal Marines and the military and people in general have had probably the biggest year for this type of stuff, suicide, right?
Mm.
I don't know the figures, but so those people have had the same training as I have. So it's not necessarily about that. There must be some sort of, for me, like a bias or the way that, my genetics that make me be like that, where I think, right, well, I'm going to get on with this and do that then, and have that bias to action. So, I think identity, and to be honest, I'm probably going through the same thing now. Um, with identity for the last 16 or 17 years, I've been the guy who gets film crews and people into extreme locations and does extreme things, and it's been very, it's been a great part of my life. It's been amazing. But those jobs and television and all of that is changing now. So, whether I like it or not, it is coming to an end. I've sort of seen that coming for the last 2 years and spent a lot more time learning the psychology of human performance and becoming a coach. It's not dead yet, but I've seen it coming. So I'm going to be going through the same thing
Mm.
again, which I don't mind because, I can see what that change and that uncomfortable feeling from the Marines gave me all of this that I do and have now.
Mm.
And I'm sure that the same will happen in this next period. And, it goes back to that optimism and confidence and coping. Like, I don't know how it's going to till now. And there's lots of shit things going on in the world right now, war fighting and scarcity and resources and AI and robotics, and everything is changing, and it's very volatile. That whole VUCA thing, volatile and uncertain, complex and ambiguous. But I have a, rightly or wrongly, I've got a feeling that I will be okay and I will make things okay regardless of what happens.
Mm.
And I think that is that identity piece, and having that confidence and coping and optimism does actually help you transition, because it will, from what I can see, is that change is almost the only constant thing that happens. And so just getting your head around that and being cool with not having all the answers, again, builds more capacity for resilient outcomes.
Mm. Yeah, and with change comes lack of control in some things. And it sounds like you talked about choosing how you respond. And certainly one of the things I was taught by a lovely guy from the FBI was, you can't control what other people do. And that's the same for the world. You can't control what's happening in the world. The only thing that you have any control over is how you choose to respond, which is logical rather than reacting, which is emotional. So yeah, same
Yeah.
same lessons, just in a different form. Yeah, lovely. Thank you. And then the last one, Ada, that I'll bring you to is asking for help. How important is that, do you think, to be able to
Uh,
ask for help?
I can tell you how important it is from science-based, because the sort of training stuff that I've done with Professor Andy McCann, it's almost one of the first things that he mentions is that asking for help is one of the biggest predictors of a resilient outcome. So for anyone that's struggling, and it's actually now the main thing. I'm not trained in any of this stuff, but I've certainly seen plenty of my mates struggle. Um, I personally, when I came back from Iraq, proactively went and sought out what therapy basically, because not because at that moment in time I thought that I was going to struggle, but it's quite, I don't know, I mean, to be 26 and doing that off my own back, there was no help back then. I just didn't want to be having to deal with that in 20 years time from what I'd seen in Iraq and fighting over there. So I proactively came back and thought, right, well, and it's weird, like blokes, for example, will go to the gym, damage the rotator cuff, and they'll spend, the next 10 days like researching all this stuff online and YouTube videos about how they fix it. And they'll go to the physio and they'll go to the doctor and they'll fix the problem. But when it comes to like not feeling good or a mental health issue, we sort of shy away from it, and we don't want to try and fix it. Or if we can't fix it, we don't want to tell anyone. There's like a stigma that goes with it. And so I think that's what I've been trying to get out there is like in elite, high performing teams, there's a psychological safety there which says I can put my hand up at any time and say I'm scared, I'm not able to do this, I can't do it, I need help. And there's zero comeback other than let's help you get this sorted. And I think there's that in general populous populations, there's probably a viewpoint that I should be able to manage this. I should be able to carry this load. And, we forget that the load that we carry now mentally, the burden that we have to carry now with everything that we do work-wise and all of the things we've ever done wrong and right in our past and all of the tech and all of this stuff, it's a huge weight. And yet we do zero really proactively to manage it. That's the first thing. And then the second thing is when it does get too much, we don't want to talk about it. We don't want to say, how can I get this fixed? But anyway, I came back and I was like, right, what can I do proactively to make sure this doesn't bite me in the arse? And I went and got therapy, 6 months. And not like I have no idea whether it worked, it didn't work, but I talked through everything that was, on my mind about that. And I've just found it just a really good way of dealing with things now. I can give you 10 examples of stuff that really put the willies up me in one way or another over the years, whether it's being inside a volcano when it erupts, or nearly being killed by rockfall, or nearly being, taken down by narcos, and it's that rumination, all the rest of it, which can lead to a lot of this stuff. And so I find, I'm very open. I talk to lots of people. I come home, I talk to anyone that will listen, my mates. I'm proactively, let's go mountain biking, and we chat about the stuff. And really that's, it goes back to probably the three things that we've talked about there: your identity, your values, and what was the first one?
Resilience.
Yeah, and your resilience. It all kind of ties in together. I suppose I don't have all the answers, but there's definitely a lot of stuff that we can do that helps. And then when it gets to that point of you're not sure how to fix it, is then ask for help. Ask for help much earlier than that, but that help is always there, and it doesn't have to, obviously there's lots of organizations that you can call, but my first port of call is my twin brother, Foxy, or whoever that I'll speak to about issues, knowing that there's no comeback. Probably the only effect of having that conversation is an upside. But yeah, I suppose it's understanding that it's predictive of a good outcome as if you can ask for help.
Yeah. Lovely, thank you so much. And yes, there are lots of organisations that you can go to. There's like Andy's Man's Clubs is very much available across the UK now, where you can go in, and that's a judgment-free place. And as a female, I have I'll just share this here, but I have a once a month group that I go to where there's no judgment and I can talk about anything. And for me, that will be something that's non-negotiable and will never leave my life, because being in those support circles is incredibly important. And then lastly, right at the very beginning, you talked about your two boys and how you wanted to make sure that they were going to be okay growing up as men in the world. And I'm just wondering, how are you going to do that?
Yeah, I mean it's tricky, and I certainly don't have all the answers. One is 5 and one is 2. Uh, the one thing that I have been doing for the last 3 years with the oldest one, and I'll do with the younger one once he stops climbing all over me, it is really the emotional piece. Is we and I'll be perfectly honest, the majority of what I'm doing with them is because I lack that ability, and I'm like, well, I need to learn this now that I've got these guys looking up to me. Um, and so one is they see me train, they see me do hard things, and we don't shy away from that. If I'm training in the gym, they'll come out and see me. So they're seeing that I am looking after myself physically, mentally, and emotionally. Um, we spend time every night. It takes like a minute, 2 minutes, little emotion wheel. Um, it's basically got like happy, sad, angry, like in the middle, and it goes out to. So essentially, what it is like a sort of gives you 150 or 200 vocabulary words around how you feel, and so we just get granular about, and we say, before bed, 3 things that you're grateful for, to train their brain, their amygdala, to
Mm.
see, or not their amygdala, but to reduce that from firing, so that they actually see that there's not threats everywhere. And but then on top of that is the emotion wheel. It's really like, so I would say, today, when I lost my temper with you at breakfast time, it's not because I was angry, I was frustrated. And so you can be granular about it, and I can say I was struggling with the workload that I had, and I had to be out the door. You didn't want to do this, and it went again. So really, it's probably for me, but they see that we're having these conversations, and that's probably it, really. And one example is, where I've had quite a tricky year this year with losing, my mum, my sister, my grandma, and we haven't shied away from those conversations with the boys. We're really with the oldest one, and they've seen me cry, and they've seen me regulate my emotions, and I think that's. I mean, I'm not getting it all right, of course, but I'm certainly trying, and I don't think I remember going through those things with. It's just a different time now, isn't it? It's a different era, and we can have these conversations. We know they work.
Yeah. That's great. I love that. Thank you for sharing that. We know that kids learn from observational things. You can tell them what you want, but they will observe your behavior and they will pick up on it, and they will definitely. So yeah, and I love that little emotional chart and you explaining to them about, I wasn't angry, I was frustrated, and these are the reasons why. So that's great. Aldo, thank you so much for your time. I'd just like to say, where can people find you if they'd like to learn more about you? Tell us about
Uh, yeah,
what you're doing next, because I know you've got an expedition coming up, and tell us about where they can find you on your channel for and what that was all about.
yeah. So you can find me at Aldo Kane, Kane, on social media, YouTube, that sort of stuff. And we are heading off to Bhutan in about 4 weeks, myself and two others, three former Royal Marines, and we're doing 360-kilometer trek in the high mountains of the Himalayas, and it's to raise awareness for the Royal Marines charity, the Royal Marines Association's Lifting the Lid campaign. and it's exactly about that. It's about suicide prevention and positive mental health, and we're essentially promoting to walk and talk. It's such a very basic thing, for the body to do, is to move, and you feel good when you move. There's no, you know more about this than I do, but there's no confrontation when you're side by side, and you can have the big hard conversations, but you're in nature, and there's just so many benefits to it also. So we're essentially promoting this lifting the lid campaign, which is really about walk and talk,
Mm.
share your problems, ask for help.
That's lovely. Thank you. And if people would like to see one of your extreme expeditions, just remind me of what the program's called on Channel 4. And
Yes, so on Channel 4, I think it's still on more 4, or the
yeah,
digital one is Arctic Adventure, and Arctic Adventure Ultimate Survival. And that's myself, Jason Fox, Brian Wood, and Carl Hinnett. And those guys have all been through the ringer, mentally and emotionally over the years for different reasons. And we went up and did a 500-kilometer race up in the Arctic Circle, and it was about doing hard things and having hard conversations.
lovely. Thank you. Thank you so much, Al. I really appreciate it. I know our listeners are going to get a lot from this. And yeah, I really appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thanks, Nicky.